32 years, and I would choose him again. Every single time.
What do you mean, where?
There is a kind of grief that does not announce itself with tears. It arrives quietly, on an ordinary Tuesday or a Sunday morning, or in Claudette Monroe's case, on the day she had spent 3 weeks preparing to celebrate. It arrives not with a scream but with a silence so deep and so complete that the whole world seems to hold its breath. And in that silence, everything you thought you knew about your life, every promise made, every sacrifice honored, every morning you chose to stay, rearranges itself into something you no longer recognize. That is where this story begins. Not with a courtroom, not with a confession, but with 32 candles, a breakfast made with love, and a phone call that came in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The kind of call that splits a woman's life into a before and an after, and changes everything. On the morning of June 14th, Claudette Monroe, Cleo to every person who had ever loved her, woke up before her husband, the way she had done for 32 years. She moved through her kitchen in the early light, quiet and deliberate, the way a woman moves when she is doing something she considers sacred. She brewed his coffee the way he liked it, black, 2 sugars, 1 extra minute on the press. She made his favorite breakfast. Eggs scrambled soft, stone-ground grits with a pat of butter, thick-cut bacon from the butcher on Elmwood Avenue that she had driven out of her way to buy the day before. She placed a handwritten card on the table. A card she had spent 3 evenings writing and rewriting, searching for words that could hold 32 years of a life shared. She had reserved a table at the restaurant where he had proposed, back in 1991, at a corner table by a window that looked out over the Charlotte skyline. She had worn a new dress. She was, by every measure any reasonable person could apply, a woman deeply in love, or at the very least, a woman who had made love into a daily practice, a discipline, a choice renewed every single morning for over 3 decades. By that evening, she would be sitting on the floor of her kitchen, still in that dress, with her phone pressed against her ear, listening to a stranger tell her that her husband had been living a second life. And what happened in the months that followed, in that courtroom, in that lawyer's office, in the quiet of a December morning when Cleo Monroe signed her name on a lease for something that was entirely, finally, irrevocably her own, none of it went the way that Richard Monroe had planned. Not even close. Stay with me, because this story does not end where you think it does. The most important moment, the one that will stay with you long after this video ends, it comes near the end. And I promise you, you will feel it when it arrives. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the stories we tell on this channel, they are the kind that stay with you. Now, let us go back to the beginning. To understand what happened to Cleo Monroe on June 14th, you have to understand who she was before that day. You have to understand where she came from, what she was made of, and why, when the worst night of her life arrived, she did not fall apart the way Richard Monroe had privately assumed she would. Claudette Monroe was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1966. The middle daughter of Reverend James Beaumont and his wife Dorothy. She grew up in a household where Sunday was sacred, where the table was always set for more people than lived in the house, and where her mother's kitchen was the center of everything, the place where the neighborhood gathered, where grief was processed over sweet potato pie, where celebrations were measured in the quality of the cornbread and the depth of the pot of red beans simmering on the back burner. Cleo absorbed all of it. She was the kind of child who paid attention to people, to patterns, to the way things worked beneath the surface. Her teachers noted it. Her father preached about it from the pulpit, though he never said her name. He would say, "Some people see the world the way it appears, and then there are those who see it the way it actually is." Cleo was the second kind. She was the first in her family to earn a college degree, graduating from Tennessee State University in 1988 with a degree in education. She had wanted to be a teacher since she was 7 years old, not because someone told her to, but because she had a gift for it that was apparent to anyone who watched her interact with children. She could explain a difficult thing in a way that made it feel simple, and she never made a child feel small for not knowing something. She moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, in the spring of 1989, having accepted a position as a teacher's aide at an elementary school in the NoVA neighborhood. She was 23 years old, living in a one-bedroom apartment, sending a portion of every paycheck back to Memphis, and building a life for herself with the same quiet determination she brought to everything. She had not come to Charlotte looking for love. She was not the kind of woman who organized her life around the arrival of someone else. And perhaps that is precisely why, when Richard Monroe walked into that real estate open house on a Wednesday afternoon in April of 1989 and introduced himself with that easy, unhurried smile of his, she did not immediately recognize what was happening. She just thought he was interesting. She thought he asked good questions. She thought, when he called the office the next day and asked if she would like to have dinner, that there was no good reason to say no. Richard Allen Monroe was 30 years old when he met Cleo Beaumont. He had grown up in Gastonia, a small city west of Charlotte, in a family that was comfortable without being wealthy. His father had managed a hardware supply company. His mother had worked part-time as a bookkeeper. He had attended UNC Charlotte, studied business, graduated without distinction but without difficulty either, and had spent his mid to late 20s working his way up through a mid-size real estate development firm in Charlotte. He was charming in a way that did not immediately read as performance. He made eye contact, he remembered details, he laughed at himself before he laughed at anyone else. He was, by the standards of 1989 Charlotte, a man with prospects. He was also, though neither he nor Cleo would have put it this way at the time, a man who had a deep and lifelong need to be admired by the person closest to him, and who had never yet been tested by the ordinary difficulty of a long marriage. But that was not visible yet. What was visible was the smile, the steadiness, the sense that this was a man who would show up. And so, in the spring of 1989, Cleo Beaumont agreed to dinner. And then another dinner. And then she stopped counting. Their courtship was not without its complications. In Charlotte in 1989, an interracial couple, a black woman and a white man, was not invisible. People noticed. Sometimes people said things. Both of their families had questions, which is a polite way of saying that both of their families had to be persuaded in different ways by different arguments, over different kitchen tables and phone calls and Sunday dinners. Cleo's father, Reverend Beaumont, was not opposed to Richard as a person. He was cautious about the world Richard came from, and what that world would do to his daughter. He asked Richard once to sit with him in his study, and he asked him directly, "Do you understand what you are asking her to carry?" Richard, to his credit, did not flinch. He said, "I think I'm beginning to." Reverend Beaumont looked at him for a long time and then said, "Beginning is the right word. You will spend the rest of your life learning the rest of it." And Richard had nodded, and Cleo's father had given his blessing, though he would tell Dorothy later that night that he hoped the boy meant what his eyes said. They married in June of 1992. Cleo wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. Richard cried during the vows. His sister Joyce, standing at the altar as a bridesmaid, caught Cleo's eye during the ring exchange and mouthed the words, "Welcome to the family." Cleo had smiled. She had felt in that moment like a woman who had made exactly the right choice. And for a long time, for a very long time, that feeling held. They built a life together in Charlotte that was, by any honest accounting, a good one. They moved from a rented apartment into a small house in the Dilworth neighborhood. And then when Marcus was born in 1994 and the house began to feel its size, into a larger home in the suburb of Matthews, a 4-bedroom house with a yard that Cleo filled with hydrangeas and a vegetable garden and a pergola she had built herself one summer, from a YouTube tutorial and sheer stubbornness. Their daughter Alicia came 2 years after Marcus. Cleo taught at the same elementary school for 26 years, eventually becoming a lead teacher and then a curriculum specialist, earning the kind of quiet, specific respect that does not come with press coverage but is felt deeply by every parent whose child passed through her classroom. Richard's real estate business grew steadily. Not spectacularly, Not in the way that made the business pages, but solidly. Properties acquired carefully, relationships built over years, a reputation in Charlotte's commercial real estate market as a man who was honest and reliable and did not overextend. They were not rich. They were something arguably more durable, stable. They traveled when they could. A trip to Savannah. A long weekend in New York. One unforgettable 2-week vacation to the Caribbean that Marcus and Alicia still talked about at family dinners. They argued about money sometimes, and about Richard's working hours, and occasionally about the subtle, specific exhaustion of being the only black person in a room that Richard moved through comfortably and expected Cleo to move through too. But they came back from those arguments. They talked through them. They went to couples counseling twice in 30 years. Once when the children were young and the pressure was immense, and once when Alicia left for college and the house went quiet in a way that neither of them had fully prepared for. Both times they came out the other side having chosen each other again. At least that was how Cleo understood it. She would later understand that the choosing in the final decade of their marriage had perhaps been more one-sided than she knew. The change in Richard Monroe was not sudden. It never is. It was gradual in the way that erosion is gradual. You do not see it happening, but one day you look at the riverbank and realize that what was once solid ground has simply disappeared, quietly, over time, without anyone sounding an alarm. Richard turned 60 in the fall of 2021. He had a party. Cleo organized it, as she organized most things in their life, with care and attention and a guest list that reflected 30 years of shared community. 50 people in their backyard. Music, food, a slideshow of photographs that moved several people to tears. Richard laughed and hugged everyone and gave a toast that included a long tribute to Cleo, during which he took her hand and said, in front of all 50 people, that she was the best decision he had ever made. The room applauded. Cleo squeezed his hand, and she meant it, what she felt in that moment. She believed him. Why would she not? Why would any woman, standing in the backyard of the life she had spent 30 years building, have reason not to believe the man who had just told 50 people that she was the best decision he had ever made? But Richard Monroe at 60 was fighting a quiet war against something he could not name and would not have admitted to if you had asked him directly. It was not unhappiness exactly. He would have rejected that word. It was something more like a creeping awareness that the life he was living was the only life he was ever going to have, that the trajectory was set, the ceiling established, the story already mostly written. His business had plateaued. Not failed, plateaued, which is in some ways harder to sit with because it offers no clear villain and no dramatic turnaround, just the quiet confirmation that you have arrived at approximately the level you were going to arrive at. Several of his contemporaries had done significantly better. One had sold a development company for an amount that made the local news. Another had retired at 58 to a house on Lake Norman that Richard had driven past more than once. Richard Monroe began to spend time on his phone late at night, scrolling through things he could not quite articulate wanting. He began to pay close attention to how other men his age presented themselves, at the gym, at networking events, in the way they dressed and laughed and leaned in toward younger people who seemed to find them impressive. He was not, he told himself, looking for anything. He was just noticing. This is always how it begins. Not with a decision, but with a noticing that slowly becomes a hunger that slowly becomes a plan. Brittany Cole was hired as a junior associate at Richard's firm in January of 2022. She was 31 years old, ambitious, sharp, and possessed of the particular skill of making older men feel that their experience was not a liability but a profound resource that only she was fully equipped to appreciate. She was not naive, she understood exactly the dynamic she was navigating, and she was not entirely without calculation in how she navigated it. Richard Monroe was her employer. He was also, she recognized quickly, a man who had not been genuinely admired in a professional context in some time, and who responded to admiration like a plant responds to water. She called him visionary. She deferred to his judgment in meetings and then in private, asked him questions that suggested she valued his perspective above anyone else's in the room. She laughed at his stories, the old ones he had told 100 times, The ones that Cleo had stopped laughing at years ago, not because they were not still somewhat charming, but because 32 years of a shared life produces a particular kind of comfortable familiarity that does not always look like admiration from the inside. Richard Monroe, who had not felt young in the way he wanted to feel young in over a decade, began to feel it again. And he made choices that he would spend the remainder of his life being unable to fully justify, even to himself. The affair began, as best as can be determined from the account of events, in the spring of 2022, approximately 14 months before June 14, 2023. It was not an accident. It was not a moment of weakness that became something more. It was, by every indication, a deliberate choice made by a man who convinced himself, with remarkable efficiency, that he deserved it. He convinced himself that his marriage had become a performance rather than a partnership. He convinced himself that Cleo, who loved him in the steady, nourishing way that she loved everything, deeply, quietly, without constant declaration, did not really see him anymore. He had, over the course of many late nights and many private conversations with Brittany in parking garages and hotel lobby bars and the offices of properties he was supposed to be evaluating professionally, constructed an entirely alternate version of his marriage, one in which he was the neglected party, the man who had given and never truly received, the man who had settled for a life that was good enough when he deserved one that was exceptional. It is worth pausing here to note that this version of events had virtually no relationship to reality, but it was the version he needed in order to do what he was doing, and so he held on to it. And Cleo Monroe, teaching her last year before retirement, planting her hydrangeas, planning their 32nd anniversary dinner at the restaurant with the corner table and the view of the Charlotte skyline, had absolutely no idea. She noticed things, of course. Cleo Monroe was not a woman who did not notice things. She noticed that Richard had become slightly more careful about his phone. She noticed that he had started going to the gym with what felt like new urgency, and that he had bought several items of clothing that were, she thought, slightly more expensive and slightly more youthful than what he usually chose. She noticed that he was sometimes distracted at dinner, in a way that felt different from the ordinary distraction of a man with work on his mind. She asked him once directly, "Is there something you need to tell me?" And Richard Monroe had looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she would later describe to her attorney as the most convincing lie she had ever witnessed in person, and said, "I'm just tired, Cleo. It's just work." She believed him. She had believed him for 32 years. There was no reason from the inside to stop. And then came June 14th, their 32nd anniversary. The morning of the coffee and the grits and the handwritten card and the new dress and the corner table reserved at the restaurant where he had proposed. Richard came downstairs that morning and he did all the right things. He thanked her for breakfast, he read the card, he kissed her on the top of her head the way he had always done. And then he said he had to go into the office for a few hours, some issue with a property closing that could not wait, but he would be back by 6 and they would have the whole evening together. He said this looking directly at her. She told him not to be late. He said he would not be. He walked out of the house, got into his car and drove away. He did not come home that evening. He would not sleep in that house again. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Cleo's phone rang. The number was unknown to her. Not Brittany Cole's number, not anyone in Richard's business circle, not a number she had any reason to recognize. She almost did not answer. She was in the middle of grading papers. She had retired from the classroom but was still doing some part-time curriculum work from home, and unknown numbers in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon were rarely anything worth stopping for. But something made her answer. She would think about that something for a long time afterward. She picked up the phone, and on the other end of the line was a young woman who identified herself only by her first name, Tamara, and who said, with a calmness that Cleo would later describe as the most surreal part of an entirely surreal experience, that she felt Cleo deserved to know the truth. Tamara was Brittany Cole's roommate. She had watched for 14 months as a married man came in and out of their shared world, using Brittany's apartment, leaving his car in their parking lot, sitting at their kitchen table on Sunday mornings as though he lived there. She had watched her roommate make choices she did not agree with, and she had argued with her about it, and she had reached her own limit. And so she called. She told Cleo that Richard was with Brittany right now, that afternoon at that moment, and that he had told Brittany in Tamara's hearing that he loved her. Cleo Monroe set her phone down on the kitchen table very carefully, as though it were something fragile, and then she sat down on the kitchen floor, still in her anniversary dress, still wearing the earrings she had put on that morning in anticipation of a dinner that was not going to happen. She sat on that floor for a very long time. And this is the part of the story that matters, the part that separates what happened next from what usually happens in stories like this one. Because Cleo Monroe, sitting on that kitchen floor in her anniversary dress, did not fall apart. She felt the ground shift underneath her, yes. She felt the specific physical sensation of her world reorganizing itself around a new and terrible truth. She cried. She would be the first to tell you that she cried, quietly, for a while, alone in that kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the curtains and the anniversary card she had written sitting on the table above her. But beneath the grief, something else was already happening. Something steady. Something that had been quietly building in Cleo Monroe for 58 years, through a childhood in Memphis and a college education earned on her own terms and 26 years of shaping children's minds and 32 years of showing up for a life that had, without her full knowledge, been only partially returned. What was building in her was not anger, though there would be anger later. What was building in her, there on that kitchen floor, was clarity. And Cleo Monroe, when she finally stood up, straightened her dress, and walked to the counter to pick up her phone, she did not call Richard. She called attorney Linda Park. Richard Monroe came home that evening at 8 o'clock, 2 hours late for a dinner that no longer existed, smelling of a perfume that was not his wife's, and wearing the expression of a man who has been rehearsing what he is going to say. He found Cleo sitting at the kitchen table. The candles she had bought for the anniversary dinner were on the counter, unlit. The card she had written was still on the table. She had not cleared the morning's dishes, an unusual thing, for a woman as ordered as Cleo. She was sitting with her hands folded, her reading glasses off, looking at the door when he came through it, as though she had been waiting for exactly this moment, and had decided precisely what she was going to do with it. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand up. She said simply and directly, "Tell me the truth. All of it. Right now." And Richard Monroe, confronted by the absolute, unwavering stillness of the woman he had underestimated for 32 years, did something that would later surprise even his own attorney. He told her everything. He told her about Brittany Cole, about 14 months, about how it had started and what he had told himself to justify it and how he had not known until very recently what he actually wanted. He talked for a long time. His voice broke more than once. He used the word deserve. He said he thought he deserved to be happy, and Cleo listened to that word without changing her expression. When he was finished, the kitchen was completely quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside. Cleo Monroe looked at her husband of 32 years and said 3 words. "Then you should go." He went upstairs and packed a bag. He was gone within 45 minutes. And Cleo Monroe, alone in her kitchen, with 32 unlit candles on the counter and an anniversary card on the table, picked up her phone and called Linda Park's after-hours line and left a message that said, "Linda, it's Claudette Monroe. Something has happened. I need to meet with you as soon as possible. I have a great deal of information and I am ready to use it." She then called her best friend, Denise Carter. She then made herself a cup of tea. And she sat down with a yellow legal pad and began to write. Now, here is something that the story of Richard Monroe's departure tends to obscure, because the drama of the betrayal is so large that it is easy to miss what was happening alongside it. While Richard was packing that bag upstairs, while he was moving through the bedroom where he and Cleo had slept for 20 years, opening drawers and pulling clothes from hangers with the slightly dazed efficiency of a man who cannot quite believe the situation he has created for himself, Cleo Monroe was at the kitchen table doing something that would prove to be the most consequential act of the entire proceeding. She was writing down from memory every financial account, every investment portfolio, every property holding, every business arrangement that she knew about in the Monroe household. And she knew about all of them, because for 32 years, Cleo Monroe had been the one who managed their household finances. She had paid the bills and tracked the accounts and organized the tax documents and coordinated with their accountant each spring. Richard had handled his business finances, yes, but the household books, the investment accounts they had opened together, the property records, the insurance policies, the retirement accounts, all of that had lived in Cleo's domain. She knew the account numbers. She knew the brokerages. She knew where the documents were kept and which attorney had drawn up their wills, and what their combined assets were worth to within a few $1,000s. Richard Monroe, in leaving the person who managed his household finances, had made what attorney Linda Park would later describe in a deposition as a significant and elementary error. He had left the person who knew everything. Denise Carter arrived at Cleo's door the following morning at 8 a.m., 45 minutes after Cleo called her. Having driven across Charlotte in the pre-rush hour quiet with a pound cake, a bottle of wine, and an expression on her face that Cleo recognized immediately, the expression of a woman who is prepared to be whatever her friend needs, for as long as it takes. Denise and Cleo had been friends since their freshman year at Tennessee State. Over 30 years of knowing each other through every significant event of each other's lives, weddings and babies and job losses and the death of parents and the ordinary, daily maintenance of a friendship that had outlasted most of the other relationships in both of their lives. Denise had liked Richard well enough over the years. She had liked him the way you like your best friend's husband when your best friend is happy, with a kind of peripheral warmth that is entirely conditional on his continued decency. When Cleo opened the door, Denise looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Are you okay?" And Cleo said, "I'm better than okay. I just found 3 accounts he forgot I knew about." Denise put down the pound cake and sat down at the kitchen table, and by 9 o'clock that morning the two of them were working through Cleo's legal pad together, Denise asking questions and Cleo answering them with the precision of a woman who had spent the night not grieving but organizing. Linda Park had been practicing family law in Charlotte for 22 years. She was the kind of attorney who spoke in complete sentences and never promised what she could not deliver and had, over the course of 2 decades, developed an almost clinical ability to assess a case's strengths and weaknesses within the first 30 minutes of a client meeting. When Cleo sat down across from her the following Thursday morning with her yellow legal pad and a folder of documents she had pulled from their home files the previous evening, Linda Park read through everything in near silence for a very long time. Then she set the papers down, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at Cleo with an expression that was neither reassuring nor alarming. It was simply precise. She said, "Mrs. Monroe, North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. Everything built during the marriage is subject to division, and the question of how it is divided is significantly affected by the conduct of the parties." She said, "Adultery in North Carolina is what we call an absolute bar. It affects alimony directly." She said, "What you have given me today is a very complete picture of your marital estate, and I want to be honest with you because I am always honest with my clients." She paused. She said, "Your husband made a significant error. He left the person who knew everything about his money." Cleo Monroe looked at Linda Park and said, "I know. That's why I called you." Linda Park almost smiled. She picked up her pen. She said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." And Cleo talked for 90 minutes without stopping. Richard Monroe, in those same weeks, was beginning to discover that the new life he had imagined had a somewhat different texture than he had anticipated. He moved into a corporate apartment on the south side of Charlotte, a furnished, anonymous space that was designed for short-term business travelers and communicated, in every detail, the temporariness of the life being lived inside it. He and Brittany had begun carefully to exist in public together, dinners, a weekend trip that several people in his professional circle noticed and noted. His son Marcus, who had learned about the affair through his mother, stopped returning his father's calls. Not with a dramatic statement, not with a confrontation, simply stopped. Richard would call. Marcus would not answer. This went on for weeks and then months. His daughter Alicia, who lived in Atlanta, sent her father one email. The email was 2 sentences long. Richard would later describe it in a deposition as one of the most painful things he had ever read. He did not share its contents. His attorney advised him not to. His business partner of 18 years, a man named Dwight Harrigan, called him into a meeting in the 3rd week of July, 6 weeks after Richard had left the house on Mapleton Drive. Dwight was a careful man, deliberate in his speech, not given to sentiment or to unnecessary confrontation. He had known Richard for nearly 2 decades and had, over those 2 decades, watched him build something worth respecting. He sat across from Richard in the conference room of the office they had shared for 14 years and he said, without preamble, "Rick, I need you to know that 3 of our major clients have requested to be transitioned to other contacts within the firm." Richard asked which clients. Dwight told him. 2 of them were business owners that Cleo had introduced to Richard years earlier, women she had known through the community, through church, through the kind of deep, lateral network that Cleo Monroe had built over 30 years in Charlotte, a network that Richard had benefited from substantially and had perhaps not fully understood the source of until it began to retract. "Word gets around," Dwight said quietly. "I just need you to know that." Richard said he understood. He went back to his office and sat for a long time looking out the window at a parking lot. He was beginning to understand that the life he had planned to move into was not as available to him as he had assumed. But he had not yet understood the full extent of what was coming. He did not yet know about the emails. Joyce Monroe was Richard's younger sister by 4 years. She had been a bridesmaid in the 1992 wedding. She had held Cleo's hand in the hospital when Marcus was born. She had spent Thanksgiving at the Monroe house for 23 of the last 30 years, and considered Cleo not her sister-in-law but simply her sister, in the way that the distinction between legal and chosen family collapses over sufficient time and shared experience. Joyce had known about the affair. She had not known from the beginning. She had found out approximately 6 months before June 14th, when Richard, in what she would later describe as an astonishing lapse in judgment, had reached out to her for advice. He had explained the situation. He had asked her what she thought he should do. And then, over several subsequent emails and phone calls, he had done something that no attorney would ever have advised him to do if he had thought to ask one. He had discussed in writing in emails sent from his personal account to his sister's personal account, his concerns about the forthcoming divorce and his thoughts about how to protect certain assets from the settlement process. He had mentioned in those emails a rental property that was titled in his brother Gary's name. He had mentioned an investment account that he had opened in the name of a limited liability company 18 months prior. He had mentioned a pattern of cash withdrawals that he framed in the emails as preparatory measures. Joyce had told him in her responses that she thought he was making a terrible mistake. She had told him to stop the affair, come clean with Cleo, and try to save the marriage. He had not taken this advice. And Joyce, who had kept every email, who had printed them and placed them in a folder in the drawer of her home office desk, had sat with the weight of what she knew for 6 months before she picked up the phone and called Cleo Monroe. She called 3 weeks after Richard left. She told Cleo she was sorry. She told Cleo she had known and had tried to stop it. She told Cleo she had something that she needed to send to Linda Park, and that she hoped Cleo would not hate her for having taken so long. Cleo listened to all of it. When Joyce finished, Cleo said, "I could never hate you, Joyce. Send everything to Linda today." And then she said, "Are you all right?" And Joyce Monroe, who had expected many possible responses to that question, had not expected that one. She cried for a long time. Cleo held the phone and waited. They talked for another hour after that. They made a plan. The manila envelope arrived at Linda Park's office 3 days before the first scheduled court date. Linda read its contents once, sitting at her desk with the door closed. Then she called Cleo. She said, "Claudette, I need you to come in. I need you to be prepared for the fact that what happens in that courtroom is going to be significant." Cleo said, How significant, Linda said. I have been practicing family law for 22 years. This is among the most complete set of documentation I have received in a case of this nature. Richard's exposure here is substantial. Cleo was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Linda, I need you to understand something. I am not doing this out of revenge. I built that life too. Every dollar in those accounts passed through my hands at some point. Every client relationship he has was supported by my community, my labor, my name attached to his in this city. I am not asking for what I want. I am asking for what I am owed. Linda said, I understand completely. I will see you Thursday morning. Cleo said, I'll be there. She straightened her blazer, even though she was sitting alone in her kitchen, because that was the kind of woman she was. The divorce proceedings of Monroe versus Monroe were scheduled to begin on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, 2023. The courtroom was not large and it was not full. This was a civil proceeding, not a criminal trial, and there were no cameras, no reporters, no public gallery in the way that dramatic legal proceedings are sometimes depicted. But there were people in the rows behind the bar. Marcus Monroe sat in the third row, alone, in a dark suit that he had bought for the occasion. Denise Carter sat beside him, her posture impeccable, her expression carefully neutral. And in the back row, quietly in a charcoal gray coat, was Joyce Monroe. She had driven from Gastonia that morning. She had not told her brother she was coming. Richard arrived with his attorney, a man named Bradford Ellison, who was competent and experienced and who had, in the days before the hearing, been working with a set of financial disclosures that his client had provided without, it would emerge, complete candor. Richard sat at the respondent's table and did not make eye contact with anyone in the rows behind the bar. Not with Marcus. Not with Denise. Not with his sister, whom he did not see until the hearing had already begun. Cleo arrived with Linda Park at 5 minutes before the scheduled start time. She was wearing deep burgundy, a color that Denise had selected, holding the dress up in Cleo's bedroom the morning before and saying, "This is not the color of a woman who is falling apart." Cleo had agreed. She wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. She walked to the petitioner's table, set her folder down, and sat with her hands folded and her spine straight and her eyes clear. She had slept 7 hours the night before. She had made herself breakfast that morning. She was ready. Linda Park presented the case over the course of 2 days. She was methodical to a degree that the judge, a woman in her 50s with 20 years on the family law bench who had seen a great many things, appeared to find both unusual and impressive. She laid out 32 years of marital assets with the precision of an accountant and the narrative skill of a storyteller. She presented documentation of Cleo's contributions, not just the financial ones, though those were substantial, but the relational ones, the client introductions, the community connections, the years of household management that had freed Richard to focus on his business with a degree of single-mindedness that would not have been possible if he had been attending to any of the domestic labor that Cleo had managed invisibly and completely for 3 decades. She presented the account records. She presented the property documents. And then she presented Joyce's emails. Bradford Ellison asked for a recess when the emails were introduced. The judge denied the request. Ellison attempted a procedural challenge to the admissibility of the communications. The judge denied that as well. Richard Monroe sat at the respondent's table and read the printed copies of his own emails, the ones he had sent to his sister asking for advice about how to protect his assets from his wife, and his expression was the expression of a man who has just fully understood, for the first time, the magnitude of the error he has made. But the emails were not the most devastating moment of the proceeding. The most devastating moment came on the second day of the hearing, when Linda Park called a witness whose involvement Richard's attorney had not anticipated, had not been given sufficient notice to prepare for, and could not effectively counter. Tamara Ellis, Brittany Cole's roommate, the woman who had made that phone call on the afternoon of June 14th, had come forward voluntarily 3 weeks before the court date to offer Linda Park something she had in her possession, Tamara had, on multiple occasions over the course of 14 months, used Brittany's phone to make calls when her own phone was charging. On one of those occasions, she had accidentally accessed Brittany's voicemail. She had listened, out of a curiosity she was not proud of, to several messages that Richard Monroe had left. She had found them disturbing. She had saved the recordings to her own phone. She had, in the weeks following June 14th, made the decision that she was going to tell someone who could use them. On the second day of Monroe versus Monroe, those voicemails were played in that courtroom. In the most significant of them, recorded in Richard Monroe's own voice, during what appeared to be a private moment in which he believed he was speaking only to Brittany, Richard could be heard discussing in considerable detail his strategy for protecting certain assets in the event of a divorce. He used Cleo's name. He said she would never figure it out because she trusted him completely. The courtroom was very quiet while the recording played. Marcus Monroe in the third row closed his eyes and kept them closed for a long time. Joyce Monroe in the back row looked at the ceiling. Cleo Monroe looked straight ahead, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her expression entirely still, and she simply waited for the recording to end. The settlement was reached the following week, in a series of meetings between the attorneys that Bradford Ellison would later describe to a colleague as among the most one-sided negotiations of his professional career. Under the terms of the final agreement, Cleo Monroe was awarded 63% of all marital assets. She retained the family home on Mapleton Drive. She received a substantial share of the rental property portfolio, including the property that had been titled in Richard's brother Gary's name, and which the discovery process had established was, in all meaningful financial senses, a marital asset regardless of how it had been titled. She was awarded alimony, structured, legally airtight and significant in its monthly amount, for a period of 12 years, reflecting the duration of her retirement from full-time employment, her contributions to Richard's business network, and the adultery findings that under North Carolina law functioned as an absolute bar to Richard's own alimony claim. Richard Monroe walked out of that process with less than 40% of what he had walked in with. His attorney's fees had been substantial. His business, under the weight of the ongoing settlement payments and the client departures that had begun in the summer, was operating at a loss for the first time in 18 years. And Brittany Cole, who had accepted a position with a real estate development firm in Atlanta, had relocated 2 weeks before the final hearing date. She had not told Richard she was leaving until the morning she left. He found out via a text message sent from the parking lot of their apartment complex, which said simply that she was sorry for the way things had worked out and that she hoped he would be okay. He sat in his corporate apartment and read that text for a very long time. In the 6 months following the settlement, Richard Monroe's life contracted steadily and without drama. His daughter Alicia did not come to Charlotte for Christmas. His son Marcus came once in November, for a dinner that lasted 2 hours and ended politely but without any of the warmth that had characterized their relationship before. Richard tried twice more to call Marcus with genuine regularity. Marcus answered occasionally, spoke with the careful neutrality of a man choosing his words, and never extended the conversation beyond what courtesy required. Richard attempted to repair things with Dwight Harrigan, who was willing to talk and not willing to pretend that the professional damage was smaller than it was. He said, "Rick, some of this is going to take time that you may not want to wait for." Richard did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. In month 4 of his post-settlement life, Richard Monroe had a cardiac event. He was at his office alone in the early evening when he felt the chest tightness and the spreading pain down his left arm that no person of his age and in his circumstances can afford to dismiss. He drove himself to Carolina's medical center because the thought of calling someone and having to explain where he was and why he was alone did not feel manageable in that moment. He spent 2 nights in the hospital. The cardiologist told him it was a warning, significant, requiring medication and lifestyle changes, but not a heart attack. During those 2 nights, one person came to see him. His sister Joyce. She sat in the chair beside his bed for 3 hours the first evening without either of them saying very much. He thanked her for coming. She said, "Of course I came. You're my brother." Neither of them said anything more about the emails or the courtroom or Cleo. Some things by that point had been said enough. While Richard Monroe's world was quietly reducing itself to its essential dimensions, Cleo Monroe was doing something she had not done in 32 years. She was living entirely for herself. The adjustment was not instant and it was not without difficulty. She would not pretend otherwise, and Denise would not let her pretend it even if she tried. There were nights in the first months when the house on Mapleton Drive felt less like a victory and more like a museum, a space full of 32 years of accumulated shared life that she had to slowly and deliberately decide which parts of were hers. She redecorated the living room in the spring. She turned Richard's home office into a reading room with a window seat, and a small bookshelf and a chair she had always loved in a fabric she had always wanted. She stopped making the grocery store trips that she had organized entirely around his preferences for 32 years and started buying things she actually wanted to eat and cook with. Small things. But the small things accumulated into something that felt, after a while, like oxygen. She started sleeping past 6 in the morning. She took a Saturday morning pottery class at a studio on South Boulevard. She was, by her own admission, not particularly talented at pottery, but she enjoyed the feel of the clay and the quiet concentration of it and the company of the 7 other women in the class, none of whom she had known before and all of whom she had something to talk to by the 4th week. She and Denise took a trip to New Orleans in February. For days, the French Quarter, music every evening, food that Cleo evaluated professionally and found worthy of serious respect. She ate beignets at Café du Monde at midnight and felt, in that specific moment, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And she began to think seriously and practically about the bakery. She had always wanted a bakery. Not a dream in the vague and aspirational sense in which people hold dreams that they never intend to act on, but a specific, detailed, considered vision that she had been carrying since her early 30s, when she had realized she was a good enough baker to do it professionally and had decided, for reasons she could not now fully reconstruct, to set it aside. She researched commercial spaces. She talked to a small business advisor at the local SCORE chapter. She talked to 2 women who ran food businesses in Charlotte about what she should know and what she should not underestimate. She did the financial modeling with the same care she had brought to 32 years of household finance management, and what she found was that with the assets from the settlement and the alimony structure, and with a careful and conservative business plan, it was not just a dream. It was viable. It was, in fact, more than viable. She called Linda Park to walk through the numbers with her. Linda Park said, "Claudette, if anyone in this city has earned the right to bet on herself, it is you." Cleo said, "I know. I just needed someone else to confirm it." Linda said, "Consider it confirmed." On a Saturday morning in December, 14 months after the worst night of her life, Claudette Monroe signed a lease on a 1,200 square foot commercial space in the NovaDiary neighborhood of Charlotte, the same neighborhood where she had worked as a teacher's aide in 1989, the neighborhood where her life in Charlotte had begun. The sign above the door, which Marcus designed on a laptop at Cleo's kitchen table over a long Thanksgiving weekend, read 32. A bakery, not named for a marriage, named for the years it had taken her to arrive at herself. The soft opening was on the first Saturday of January. Alicia flew in from Atlanta on the Friday night before, arriving at the house on Mapleton Drive with a rolling suitcase and a bottle of champagne, and a hug that lasted longer than most hugs. Marcus was there by 7 in the morning to help set up. Denise stood behind the counter for the first 4 hours of service, handing out samples and telling every single person who came through the door, whether they asked or not, that the woman in the kitchen back there was the strongest person she had ever known in her life. The line went out the door and around the block. It was January in Charlotte, which meant it was cold, and people stood in that cold for up to 40 minutes to buy a piece of Cleo Monroe's sweet potato pound cake or her brown butter peach hand pies or the thick, chewy, perfect chocolate chip cookies that Denise had been telling her for 20 years she needed to sell commercially. By noon they had sold out of almost everything. Cleo stood in the kitchen of her bakery. Her kitchen, her bakery, her space, built with her labor and her settlements and her 32 years of showing up. And she pressed her palms flat on the prep counter and she took a breath. Just one breath. The kind you take when you have been holding something for a very long time and you are finally allowed to set it down. 6 months after the settlement, the same week as it happened, that the doors of 32 Bakery opened for the first time, Richard Monroe called Cleo's phone. It was a Sunday evening. Cleo was at Denise's house, sitting on the back porch with a glass of wine, going through next week's baking schedule. When she saw Richard's name on her screen, she looked at it for a long moment. Denise, sitting across from her, looked at the phone and then looked at Cleo and said one word, "Don't." Cleo picked up anyway. She would not be able to fully explain why. Maybe because she had always answered when something needed answering. Maybe because she was, by then, far enough from June 14th that the sound of his name did not carry the same weight. Maybe because she already knew, in the way that Cleo Monroe had always known things before she could articulate them, that this call was not a threat. She picked up and she said, "Richard." He said, "I'm not calling to ask for anything. I need you to know that before I say anything else." She waited. He said, "I know what I did. I know what I threw away. I know that there is no version of this where what I did was acceptable, and I know that telling you that doesn't change anything. I just needed to say it to the person it actually mattered to say it to." Cleo was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Richard said her name uncertainly to check if she was still there. She said, "I'm here." She said, "Richard, I forgave you 3 months ago. Not because what you did was forgivable. Not for your sake. For mine. I'm not built to carry that kind of weight, and I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left doing it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he started to cry. Not the strategic kind of crying, not the performed vulnerability she had watched him use throughout the proceedings, but something smaller and more genuine. The crying of a man who has finally reached the bottom of what he thought was his story and found it emptier than he expected. She did not tell him it was okay. She did not comfort him. She did not offer the absolution that was not hers to give, and that he had not earned, and that would not have helped him even if she had. She said, "Take care of yourself, Richard." And she ended the call. Denise stared at her across the porch table. She said, "How are you that calm?" Cleo picked up her wine glass. She said, "Because I'm free. And he's not." Then she picked up her baking schedule and went back to the numbers, because she had a bakery to run and a life to live, and she was not going to spend one more minute of either on the question of Richard Monroe's peace of mind. What Richard Monroe lost was real. Let no one minimize it. He lost a marriage. He lost the trust of his children. He lost significant portions of the financial security he had spent his professional life building. He lost the woman he had traded his wife for. He lost the respect of professional relationships that had taken decades to build. He ended up alone in a hospital bed with his sister in the chair beside him. These were not small losses. These were the losses of a man who convinced himself that he was the protagonist of a story about his own freedom, and discovered too late that the story had a different protagonist entirely, and that she was doing just fine without him. Here is what I have been thinking about since I first heard this story. We talk about karma the way we talk about weather, as something that happens to people, something external and impersonal that arrives eventually to balance the scales. And there is something satisfying about that framing. There is something deeply satisfying about watching a man who thought he had it all figured out discover that the person he underestimated knew everything he thought he had hidden. But I do not think karma is actually the point of this story. I think Cleo is the point. The bakery is the point. The pottery class and the New Orleans trip and the reading room with the window seat and the Sunday mornings that belong entirely to her. Those are the point. The settlement was significant, yes. The legal outcome was meaningful, yes. But what Cleo Monroe did that matters. What will still matter when the legal documents have been filed away and the courtroom records have been digitized and stored and eventually forgotten? is that she decided at 58 years old, in the aftermath of the worst year of her life, that she was not finished. That the version of her life she had put aside in 1992 was still available to her. That it had always been available to her. That the only question had ever been whether she was willing to go get it. She was willing. She went and got it. She is in that kitchen right now. Before we go, I want you to sit with a question. Not about Richard. About yourself. How many of us are waiting? Waiting for the children to be grown, or the mortgage to be lighter, or someone to give us the signal that it is our turn now. Cleo Monroe did not plan to be free at 58. Freedom arrived for her through the worst possible door. But she walked through it. And she built something better on the other side. I want to know what you think about that. I want to know whether you would have answered Richard's phone call. I want to know whether you have something, a bakery, a studio, a thing you set aside 20 years ago because the timing wasn't right, that you are still thinking about. Tell me in the comments. Every single one. I read them. And if this story reached you, if it said something you needed to hear, share it with someone who needs it too. Because sometimes a story finds exactly the person it was meant for. If you are new to NovaDiary fiction, this is what we do here. We tell stories about real feeling lives. The kind of stories that make you call your best friend, or sit quietly for a while, or stay up past midnight thinking about one sentence you cannot shake. Subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next. Because the next story, the one I have been sitting with for weeks, waiting for the right moment to tell, is about a woman who discovered her husband's secret not through a phone call, not through a confession, but through something hidden inside the walls of their house. Literally inside the walls. I will see you there.